Excerpt from An African American and Latinx History of the United States by Paul Ortiz. The Haitian Revolution and the Birth of Emancipatory Internationalism, 1770s to 1820s. The foremost issue facing the Americas in the Age of Revolution, roughly from the 1770s to the 1840s, was the future of slavery in a hemisphere bristling with anti-colonial insurgencies. In 1780, Peru's José Gabriel Concorcanqui Noguera, claiming the mantle of the last king of the Incan Empire, rechristened himself Tupac Amaru II, and with his African descendant wife, Miquela Bastidas, launched a rebellion against Spanish rule. Tupac Amaru II recruited a massive army that included indigenous Peruvians, mestizos, libertos, and slaves, in an effort to end European rule forever. In the same period, a cohort of propertied elites in Great Britain's 13 North American colonies organized a revolution to safeguard slavery, property, and political power. Thomas Jefferson and his peers sought to preserve as much as they looked to overthrow. The Founding Fathers looked primarily to Europe for inspiration. They drew on the ideas of the political theorist John Locke and other Enlightenment philosophers to construct rationales for racial slavery, the expropriation of native lands, and the control of the continent's unruly masses, disdainfully referred to by elites as, quote, the people out of doors. The wealth built up by enslaved African labor gave English colonists the resources they needed to challenge British rule and to subsequently contest European powers for domination in the Western Hemisphere. The slave plantation was the engine of early economic growth in the Americas and the force behind the rise of global markets in tobacco, sugar, molasses, dyestuffs, cotton, and other commodities. The pages of the Charleston-based South Carolina Gazette in the 1770s reveal an interior world of racial capitalism and the degradation of labor. Quote, any person who wants to hire a Negro with a good breast of milk and without a child, inquire of the printer, end quote, reads a typical item. Another advertisement noted that 3, quote, Negroes, end quote, would be sold along with brandy, porter, and empty bottles. The South Carolina Gazette was typical of commercial newspapers that promoted the breeding, trading, recapture, and punishments of African Americans in order to sustain merchant profits. Paradoxically, slave owners who placed advertisements in the Gazette to locate their runaway slaves revealed that the individuals they had reduced to private property were intelligent human beings. Refuting their captors' efforts to rob them of their humanity, enslaved Africans constantly struggled to keep families intact and escaped when possible in kin groups in efforts to reunite with family members sold away or left behind in the wake of sales. One advertisement concerning a fugitive from racial capitalism on the eve of the revolution noted, he speaks very good English and is very artful. The cash rewards for turning in fugitives, as well as the expectation that white people would offer the authorities information on runaways, is a reminder that the minority of slaveholding colonists depended on the vigilance of the majority who did not own slaves to police the system. In their fight for freedom, African American communities rejected their European theories of domination as surely as their revolutionary counterparts in Peru. Black writers looked to revolts in the global South for inspiration because these revolutions challenged slavery, the caste oppression of indigenous people, and the rule of the few over the many. This global vision of human rights was the core element of emancipatory internationalism, and it became a foundation of what Black scholar Cedric Robinson has called, quote, the Black radical tradition, end quote, a set of ideas and practices rooted in grassroots insurgencies that challenged slavery and racial capitalism at its inception. Robinson argued that, quote, Black radicalism critically emerges from African culture, languages, beliefs, and enslavement. What emerged from that conjunction were powerful impulses to escape enslavement, end quote. In the Age of Revolution, Black organizers and writers studied and celebrated Latin American and Caribbean revolutionaries such as Toussaint Louverture, Simón Bolívar, and Vicente Guerrero for profoundly enlarging the meaning of freedom in the Americas. The strength of emancipatory internationalism was its rootedness in popular movements, its accessible language of justice, and its resiliency through generations of Black thought and action. A revolution of guilty masters. Given the role that plantation owners and merchant capitalists played in the American Revolution, it is not surprising that a war of independence became a war to preserve slavery. The colonial upper class looked with trepidation at signs from Great Britain that foretold the demise of chattel bondage. Foremost among these was the English court's Somerset versus Stewart case decided in 1772. The decision resulted in the freeing of James Somerset, an enslaved African who had been brought by his master to England a few years earlier. The judge in the case found that slavery was not supported in the common law. Despite the debate in England about the ultimate meaning of Somerset in England, the decision was interpreted by many white leaders in the 13 colonies as foretelling the doom of slavery in the British Empire. Threats of insurgencies from slaves and poor colonists also convinced these leaders that a break with Great Britain was necessary. As tensions escalated between colonists and Parliament, a South Carolina planter, William Drayton, accused the Royal Navy of offering sanctuary to runaway slaves. The South Carolina Gazette published an ominous, quote, letter from London, end quote, in the winter of 1775 that accused the Crown of arming, quote, Negroes, the Roman Catholics, the Indians, and Canadians, end quote, to put down the brewing colonial rebellion. That spring, quote, a group of slaves scenting freedom in the air, end quote, approached Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, and, quote, volunteered their services, end quote, against their increasingly restless masters. Sensing that he was on precarious ground, the nervous governor initially turned away the dissident slaves. By the fall, however, Dunmore reversed course. In November, he issued a proclamation freeing slaves who promised to bear arms against the embryonic anti-colonial revolt. Dunmore sealed the Patriots' decision to escalate the revolt to a full-blown war of independence. Indeed, the third draft of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence listed as primary grievances against King George III, quote, prompting our Negroes to rise in arms among us, end quote, and in the next sentence, quote, endeavoring to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages and sexes and conditions of existence, end quote. In 1775, the revolutionary pamphleteer Thomas Paine published African Slavery in America, which indicted slavery at all levels. So monstrous is the making and keeping of them slaves at all, abstracted from the barbarous usage they suffer, and the many evils attending the practice, as selling husbands away from wives, children from parents and from each other, in violation of sacred and natural ties, opening the way for adulteries, incest, and many shocking consequences, for all of which the guilty masters must answer to the final judge, end quote. Paine wanted the rebellious colonists to look at themselves in the mirror, quote, with what consistency or decency they complain so loudly of attempts to enslave them, while they hold so many hundreds of thousands in slavery, and annually enslave many thousands more, without any pretense of authority or claim upon them, end quote. Paine's pleas for moral consistency fell upon deaf ears and hearts hardened with the lucre of chattel bondage. The English essayist Samuel Johnson wryly observed the ironies of a revolution led by guilty masters. Quote, we are told that the subjection of Americans may tend to the diminution of our own liberties, an event which none but very perspicacious politicians are able to foresee. If slavery be thus fatally contagious, how is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes, end quote. Liberty further extended. African Americans fought with every weapon at their disposal to change the course of the American Revolution away from slavery and toward freedom for all. In the fall of 1776, Lemuel Haynes, a Revolutionary War soldier in Massachusetts, took up his pen to grapple with Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. 2 years earlier, Haynes had enlisted in the Patriot cause. In April of the previous year, he and his fellow Granville, Massachusetts militia members rushed to defend Lexington from British troops. The young Minuteman later served with Ethan Allen's Green Mountain Boys at the Battle of Ticonderoga. Private Lemuel Haynes was a free black man and a soldier who believed that the American Revolution should be a war against slavery. He was born in 1753, the progeny of a black father and a white mother of respectable ancestry in Connecticut who publicly renounced him. Thus orphaned, Haynes was apprenticed to and raised by an intensely religious family in Granville. He became an ardent foe of slavery and titled his rebuttal to Jefferson's document, Liberty Further Extended, or Free Thoughts on the Illegality of Slavekeeping, wherein those arguments that are used in its vindication are plainly confuted, together with a humble address to such as are concerned in the practice. Haynes opened his challenge to the Continental Congress by quoting the highlight of the Declaration of Independence, its opening sentence. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Haynes admonished his independence-minded comrades that they should be engaged in a war against oppression. Quote, "To affirm that an Englishman has a right to his liberty," end quote, Haynes stated, quote, is a truth that has been so clearly evinced, especially of late, that to spend time in illustrating this would be but superfluous tautology, end quote. Building on this point, Haynes insisted that the goals of the revolution should not be constrained by race. Quote, "But I query whether liberty is so contracted a principle as to be confined to any nation under heaven. Nay, I think it not hyperbolical to affirm that even an African has equally as good a right to his liberty in common with Englishmen. And the main proposition which I intend for some brief illustration is this, namely, that an African, or in other terms, that a Negro may justly challenge and has an unalienable right to his liberty. Consequently, the practice of slavekeeping which so much abounds in this land is illicit," emphasis in the original, end quote. The 23-year-old citizen soldier sought to imbue the revolution with a vision much broader than that of Jefferson's and his pro-slavery countrymen. Lemuel Haynes was one of the many thousands of black freedom fighters who had been forgotten in the story of the American Revolution. The Afro-Puerto Rican scholar Arturo Alfonso Schoenberg dedicated his career to documenting black sacrifices in the development of the United States. In the formation of the American Republic, Schoenberg wrote, "The books on the history of the United States chronicle the events preceding the Revolution with fidelity and patriotic fervor. A Negro reading these books finds them lacking the substance of recording the active part of the African has played in the drama that brought to life the American nation." Several years before Haynes picked up a rifle to defend an embattled country in the making, a whaler of African and Native American descent, Crispus Attucks, went to his death battling British redcoats in the Boston Massacre. Speaking of this rebellious sailor, John Hancock of Boston, a lawyer and a patriot, declared, quote, "Who taught the British soldier that he might be defeated? Who dared look into his eyes? I place, therefore, this Crispus Attucks in the foremost rank of the men that dared," end quote. A brigade of soldiers of African descent from Haiti served alongside the Continental Army at Savannah and other battles. By the end of the war, historian Benjamin Quarles estimated that at least 5,000 African American men served in the Patriot armies. African Americans delivered numerous petitions to colonial legislatures in the years leading up to the 1776, in which they argued that emancipation should be a central goal in the clash with the British Empire. These entreaties reveal the philosophical positions on democracy that black communities had forged during the colonial era. African American petitioners noted that white patriots invoked terms such as liberty and slavery to describe their conflict with England without satisfactorily explaining either concept. These petitions borrowed from but ultimately transcended white revolutionary rhetoric. African American framers demonstrated that they had an expansive vision of liberty that did not brook compromise with chattel bondage. Black Bostonians employed a keen sense of irony in their appeal to the Boston Patriots in 1773. Quote, "The efforts made by the legislative of this province, Massachusetts, in their last sessions to free themselves from slavery gave us, who are in that deplorable fate, a high degree of satisfaction. We expect great things from men who have made a noble stand against the designs of their fellow men to enslave them. We cannot but wish and hope, sir, that you will have the same grand object. We mean civil and religious liberty in view of your next session. The divine spirit of freedom seems to fire every human breast on this continent, except as are bribed to assist in executing the execrable plan, slavery." End quote. In 1776, nearly 500,000 African Americans, more than 90% of them enslaved, lived in British North America. By the end of the Revolutionary War, nearly 100,000 slaves had braved great risks by escaping from their masters and seeking sanctuary with the British or Native Americans. The historian Sylvia Frey notes, quote, "Severe punishment and often death was a virtual certainty for an unsuccessful escape." Benjamin Corliss aptly characterized African American insurgencies in the Age of Revolution, quote, "The Negro's role in the Revolution can best be understood by realizing that his major loyalty was not to a place nor to a people, but to a principle. Insofar as he had freedom of choice, he was likely to join the side that made him the quickest and best offer in terms of those, quote, unalienable rights, end quote, of which Mr. Jefferson had spoken," end quote. The duel for labor control. The repressive contours of the new republic were visible in the efforts made by Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson to recapture former slaves who had escaped with Britain's Royal Navy at the end of the war. Hamilton moved in a session of Congress to protest, quote, "the British seizure of Negroes belonging to citizens of the United States," end quote, and Jefferson pressed the matter in a letter to George Hammond, the British envoy charged with establishing diplomatic relations between Great Britain and the United States after the war. Secretary of State Jefferson was outraged at the General Guy Carleton for overseeing the evacuation of North Americans, including former slaves. He argued that this was a violation of the Treaty of Paris, which prohibited, quote, "carrying away any Negroes or other property of the American inhabitants," end quote. Jefferson belittled the governor's argument that he was compelled by moral reasons to carry out the rescue of enslaved people, and he railed against the great indignities and financial inconveniences suffered by some of the Virginia gentry at the loss of their property. Little wonder that Hammond observed of the former Patriot leaders, quote, "I have a reason to think most of them are Tories at heart," end quote. The Patriot ruling class designed the U.S. Constitution to protect chattel bondage slavery. As Staunton Lynn noted, the Constitution gave the South disproportionate strength in the House of Representatives by adding 3/5 of the slaves to the number of white persons and apportioning congressmen to the several states. By Article 1, Section 8, which gave Congress the power to suppress insurrections. By Article 1, Section 8, which postponed prohibition of the slave trade until 20 years after the Constitution's adoption. Which postponed prohibition of the slave trade until 20 years after the Constitution's adoption by Article 4, Section 2, which provided for the return of fugitive slaves.